Good evening, I'm Dagan McDowell.
And I'm Sean Duffy. Welcome to The Bottom Line. Now, America is divided, and those in power want you to believe it's a battle of rich versus poor, urban versus rural, man versus woman. But in 2024, it's a political war between the elite and everybody else.
If you look at the country through the eyes of the one percenter, you will find 74% say they are better off today than they were in the past.
Nearly 6 in 10 say there is too much freedom in America.
In 1% land, 2/3 believe that teachers and their union should decide what children are taught, rather than leaving that to the parents.
70% trust the government to do the right thing.
And quite possibly the most stunning, striking, and nauseating, 84% give Joe Biden a pat on the back for a job well done.
Hardworking Americans could not disagree more. Now more than ever, it's us versus them, with our nation's first primary just days away.
The highfalutin snots and snobs have Joe Biden, and those hustling to provide for their families have Donald Trump. But that doesn't explain why the elitists, the elites in Davos, who are allegedly elated by Joe Biden's performance, cannot keep Trump's name out of their mouths.
People should recognize that he's a serious political force and should not discount the fact that he could well be elected again.
We are talking too much about Donald Trump in Europe, and we should prepare ourselves for a possible second term.
The fundamental difference between Trump in 2016 and Trump in 2024 is that the environment is so much more dangerous. There are major wars going on. The ability of Trump to cause so much more damage through his volatility is so much higher than it was before.
In Davos, Donald Trump is already the president. That's a good thing, because Davos, the Davos consensus is always wrong. I believe if the institutions hold, when he loses this election, he'll also be the Republican candidate in 2028, and maybe even in 2032 as well. Because, what's the way out for him? He either winds up in prison or he winds up in power.
I think the best defense, if that's the way we want to look at it, is attack.
Let's bring in the author of The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, Victor Davis Hanson. Victor, listening to these snots and snobs sitting over in Switzerland, what do you make of their yakking about Trump?
I think they're so incoherent when you hear things about there's all these wars going on and Trump could make it worse. They're completely clueless. When Trump was there, it's the first time in 4 administrations that Putin didn't go in across anybody's borders. We had no problem with Chinese balloons coming across the United States. Hamas didn't dare go into Israel. Hezbollah was not rocketing. Iran was facing really tough sanctions. So I guess to sum up their attitude is they would rather be wrong and have a terrible situation or landscape around the world, but not have Donald Trump president, rather than to have calmness with Trump president. The other subtext is these elites, both abroad and here at home, Gagan, I think the one common denominator is they have enough money and influence that they're never subject to the consequences of their own ideology. So they feel we're like lab rats, the rest of the country, the rest of the world, and they can experiment with climate change, DEI, ESG, all of these nostrums that don't work, but don't affect them when they go wrong.
It's a great point, Victor. And what I look at this, these people don't care about the American economy. They don't care about the American worker. They don't care about American freedom. They do care about a one world government, and they do get offended when Donald Trump talks about putting America first, because if America's first, then they aren't first.
Yeah, they are. We subsidize the entire defense of Europe, and the more that we subsidize them, and the more that Donald Trump finally made them pay $100 billion more for their own defense, they got angry at him. And they would have been lost if they hadn't had that extra increase in munitions when Putin invaded. So it's so incoherent. They hate him so much that they're willing to destroy their own political landscape or their own futures just so they can say Trump is not is not going to be president or he's awful. And we see the same thing here in the United States. They prefer Biden, given all the damage he'd done, rather than to have things that worked under Trump.
Well, fascism was a word that the left and the elitists like to use when describing President Trump. But in fact, the economy that Joe Biden has created with $6 trillion plus in spending in the last 3 years is economic fascism, straight from Benito Mussolini. It is a political subsidy economy. It is an industrial policy that has enriched corporate elites. It has enriched those cronies of the left, and it has impoverished those who have to work for a living. And to quote something you said, and it's a very deep and broad statement, Victor, these ideologues believe they're morally superior and smarter than anybody else, and therefore we're entitled to do things other people do not do.
Yeah, they've set a premise that Donald Trump is so toxic that any means necessary are justified. Take him off the ballot, indict him 4 times with local and state and federal prosecutors, impeach him twice, Russian disinformation, laptop disinformation, you name it. And that's all justified because he's arbitrarily constructed as a threat. And we know that he's a threat because he would solve the border problem. There wouldn't be crime in the streets. We would try to have deterrence again. He would restore deterrence abroad, and we'd be energy independent at the expense of the Russians. They would really not like that if he pumped more oil and crashed the world price. So that's it's so frustrating, and they're so incoherent and arrogant, and yet they're so limited and mediocre. They just say the same things. They learn nothing. They forget nothing. They're boring, they're banal, and I think they understand now that nobody's listening to them anymore.
But they are dangerous. But as we've talked about, Davos can't stop talking about Donald Trump, but neither can Team Biden. Listen to what Biden's 2024 co-chair said just this morning.
Donald Trump is hoping that American citizens have collective amnesia, that when he was president, he basically presided over chaos and destruction. And he thinks the American citizens are going to forget that. Donald Trump always paints a mythical picture of a past that never was and tries to convince you that that's good for you. And everybody in America knows that that's not true.
You know, Victor, Donald Trump is relying on the people don't have amnesia. They remember his economy and how great things were, the upward mobility, the kind of salary increases that they had with really low inflation. He wants them to remember that. And when they talk about chaos, the chaos was created by the left with Russia collusion, impeachments, all of the questions from the media driving a narrative on Donald Trump. I go back and look at what happened in the press room, questions from the left to Donald Trump about Russia collusion, and how calm he was actually answering their BS lying questions to him. Donald Trump didn't create chaos, he created prosperity for people.
He did. We don't have a porous border. We don't have a border. They destroyed it. They know they did. I think part of the problem and the anger is they project onto Donald Trump. The way they think, they're thinking right now, if we had done to Donald, we know what we did to Donald Trump. If they had done that to us and we were going to gain power again, we would go back and take revenge and retribution and weaponize the FBI, the DOJ like we did before. And that's what Donald Trump must do because he must think like us. So but he doesn't. For all his tough and sometimes crude rhetoric, he's not a revengeful president. He never weaponized these agencies. He never tried to have FBI people work with Twitter to suppress the news that he felt was unfavorable. But they think we're going to be, Donald Trump thinks just like we do. And we know what we would do if we got power again. We would go full blow, full bore and try to weaponize the government. And therefore, he must be doing that too. And he's not. And that's what's so frustrating to them.
This lawfare, speaking of that, is not going so well. In your latest column, Victor, it focuses on the concept that the left has yet to understand. Quote, prosecutors are discovering that the more they seek to rush to judgment before the election and gag Trump from speaking publicly about these proceedings, the more he rises in the polls. But in the column, you pick apart these cases, and this lawfare, it's falling apart.
Yeah, I think it is. Everybody said that Fani Willis's case was the jewel in the crown. It was the strongest, and it's going to implode given her behavior and unethical and probably illegal conduct. And when we look at Jack Smith's, he's trying to hasten the case to time it with the election, gag orders. I don't think that's going to work. And people say, you know, I think everybody understands the Bragg and Letitia James are just vindictive. They've never, I mean, there's nothing to them. And they don't realize that every time one of these stumbles or fails, they don't go back to square one. They're force multipliers of each other, and they turn off the people. So when you take him off the ballot, or you have these 4 indictments, and after you've impeached him, and after the laptop, and after collusion, and people just say, you know what? This is incremental. These people are pathological. They won't stop. And they think, well, we just threw a bunch of stuff out there and see what stuck. We'll keep doing it, and finally something will stick. It doesn't work that way. They're destroying their reputations, their credibility, and that's why Donald Trump is ahead of Joe Biden in the polls, even though he has 100% negative press coverage in the mainstream media, and he controls none of our institutions, not academia, not entertainment, not the corporate boardroom. They own all of that, and yet he's still ahead in the polls.
Which is why the left is losing their mind. Victor Davis Hanson, you are a national treasure. Thank you for joining us on The Bottom Line on this Friday night. We are grateful.
Very. We're grateful for your existence.
Thank you.
And your mind.
Thank you, Victor.